one night in particular, I dreamed I stole from the isolate into the forest.
Yeah, so thank you, David. Thank you, Katie, for coming together in this way to talk about what is a really fascinating subject that turns into a really beautiful work of art. The subject that we're talking about is a kind of fascinating sliver of medieval spiritual life. The Anchoress being a kind of female mystic who was, on the one hand, an integral part of the religious life of her town or village, and yet completely removed from normal life. So anchoresses had a tiny cell, like a monastic cell, that was attached to the sanctuary of a church. But it was literally bricked up in a way that once the anchoress entered the cell, there was the understanding that she would never again leave it and take part in normal life. Sometimes there was even an open grave in the cell. And the idea was that she would live the rest of her days in contemplation of her mortality, of the impermanence of existence, and take part in any religious ceremonies in the church through a tiny window that opened into the sanctuary, and occasionally receive food and also have conversations through another window that opened onto the village square. It's an extreme form of spirituality. Men also took part in it, and yet it seems to, Katie, am I right in saying it seems to have been predominantly a female practice in medieval Europe? Why were you drawn to it, Katie?
I'm sorry. Yes, so yeah, it was about a 4-to-1 ratio of women anchoresses partaking in the life of the enclosure and to the anchor hold, to one part anchorites, the male equivalent. You know, I was drawn to it, I think, because it felt like a place where I could press against some traditional theological perspectives from the Christian tradition, which is also my tradition, and which, you know, in my work since the beginning as a poet, I've kind of built my own poetry from a real sense of disturbance with and tension with my own tradition. And the anchoress, you know, the way that her mind started to be shaped by the architecture of the anchor hold fascinated me. So the psychological and spiritual pressure upon the mind, and also the freedom in the mind that occurred from enclosure. I thought that was just kind of endlessly curious and fascinating to me, as well as the idea of how an anchoress and her writings, many of them did write. Julian of Norwich is the most well-known anchoress whose writings we have, and but how the writings would also be redacted by perhaps a monk or her overseer, the priest who she would confess to. So how she also might be censored was of interest to me.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what seems to be so fertile for a poet like you are some of these extreme juxtapositions, right? That on the one hand, these women accepted a life of unbelievable deprivation. And yet, I think you've argued that it also gave them an uncommon amount of safety and a bit of autonomy, right? That women in medieval Europe certainly didn't enjoy unless they were born into very high echelons of the aristocracy. And so, like, what were some of the contrasts that as a poet you kind of sensed you could make art out of?
I mean, I think I was also interested in a very uncommon decision to live without a partner, you know, without a spouse, or anyone to have like anything physical with, or any physical touch or intimacy. You know, my anchoress, in her voice, she is really turning away from a man that she's been promised to marry. And it's because she knows deeply that he doesn't understand her, and he doesn't see the fullness of her. And she goes into the cell then as one of the few options a woman would have had in that time. So yeah, I mean, I've been stricken by, you know, learning 20 years ago when I was in divinity school that really a woman of that time would have had the choices of being a wife or a servant or a prostitute, or a nun, until the Protestant era came, and that option, you know, was taken away from a large population of women. But I am interested in the choice of solitude, and I started writing these in more earnest when my own marriage was ending, and I was finding myself navigating really a life really more alone, not fully alone, of course, but more alone.
And so, David, when you discovered Katie's poems, based on this anchoress that she creates and kind of endows with this very particular voice of her own, what kind of music did you envisage for her, and how did you go about creating, especially the vocal part of your piece? So maybe just talk us through the orchestration, and then just how did you create a voice for the anchoress?
Yeah, this is my really third collaboration with Katie, and I am completely enamored of her work and adore her as a person, and it just has been an ideal collaborator for me. So I was, it was before I was at Yaddo. Yaddo is where I kind of broke the seal on the piece, but I knew I had a project that was being funded by the Independence Foundation. We talked about writing a piece for early music ensemble, for Piffaro specifically, and then a piece with Piffaro and PRISM. And I knew I wanted to write songs. So of course I went to Katie right away and said, what are you working on, or what ideas might you have? And Katie, please revise as necessary if my memory is wrong. But she had this incredible character she had written about, the anchoress, and it was so compelling. And you know, so it was all really her message. The inspiration, the beginning, the spark of the piece came from Katie. And then there's just so much music in her poetry that that time at Yaddo was really spent just learning and I would say taking the poetry in and setting it, finding that music so that I could just bring it into the composition. The music I heard right away was for some of the more kind of bold parts of the poetry, these that when God is speaking, or these wonderful redactions. That was some of the first that came to me. But like I said, there's so much music in the words already that it was just a matter for me as the composer to find that music and to almost transcribe it.
Mm-hmm. So Katie, how would you characterize your anchoress in terms of her personality or her psychology? Like, what are the qualities that that she expresses in this poetry?
I think she's dogged in some ways, but I think she also is able to be confused. You know, I didn't want a dogmatic anchoress. I'm not really interested in that. I think dogma is already set and could be found by anyone. I'm more interested in how beliefs are internalized, and how someone's experience might press against them and really shatter them, so that they then actually evolve into a more kind of a fuller human spirituality. So, she gets confused by how to answer letters from people who ask her, what do we do when someone has a vision? How do we interpret spiritual visions? And this was something that occurred, what is actually a vision that is, a true revelation, and what is something just that occurs because we're in physical bodies that have fevers. I mean, in the medieval period, there would be discussions, like a lot of ink was spilled over these questions. And, she doesn't want to give answers, actually. And she also knows that spiritual advice doesn't resolve physical pain or illness. So someone comes to the anchor hold with these strange growths on her feet, at the bottom of her feet, and asks the anchoress, what is this? Well, she doesn't say, what is this? Where's my medieval voice? The person asks her, is it more body? And the body at that time, imagine how just terribly confusing and painful the body was. And the anchoress sends her away, but knows that no theology will heal the injury of the body. Although, that too would have been a kind of radical belief in that time. And I think in a way she's very vulnerable, but she wants to be there, Yeah, I think I'll stop with that. I do want to say too about David choosing this particular set of poems. I was really surprised because I just thought they were so odd. And he asked me kind of, what do you have on your desk that I could look at? And I just said, well, I just have this very strange sequence by an anchoress that I'm imagining. And he wanted to see it, and I was really surprised that he wanted to set it. So, all of it for me has been very unexpected that he's chosen this. In the past years, he's chosen things to work on that I've thought, yeah, that seems really smart. I like how that one, I think that could be set really, really well, or I've liked the poem, but this set, I just felt, I didn't know if I'd ever have a reader even for it. So it's really kind of a wonderful surprise that it's taken on this other life by this composer and these musicians.
Well, and David, you responded with an orchestration that is in its own way also very surprising, unexpected, and strange, because you take an ensemble of Renaissance instruments that we might expect in a setting of poems about a medieval experience, but then you put them together with a quartet of saxophones, which are so specifically part of the modern age, an instrument invented in the 19th century, right? And then also, I love the idea that the quartet with the sort of implies like the kind of bricked in stasis of the anchor hold. At least to me, it seems like, the figure 4 makes that kind of box that boxes in our anchoress. And then you have these solo instruments, like sometimes a recorder or something, that get to stand in for, the spirit that roams wherever it wants. So David, tell me a little bit, I know that you had the idea for these commissions, but what was it like bringing together these completely different animals, like into your musical menagerie?
Oh, I love that. I want all the musical menageries I can have. It was a challenge to start, right? Because the instruments themselves, there are some physical differences, not just in the sound that they make, but in the tuning. That the wind instruments actually play a high A. They play, I think it's 463 instead of 440. or thereabouts, which is our modern standard. Whereas, Renaissance strings and early strings played lower. So finding a way to reconcile that tuning difference and, as they say, turning into a feature and not a bug, it involves some transposing. So writing notes that appear different than they sound so that they can line up together between the instruments. But sometimes I want to take advantage of that difference to make a kind of a real discord in the sounds between the Renaissance instruments and the modern saxophones. But for me, the text is written by a living author, by by a contemporary person, and that's where the saxophones come in. They are very contemporary instruments. They don't have the burden of the repertoire in the same way that, say, a string quartet might. And they can kind of do anything. They're incredibly flexible. Whereas the Renaissance instruments are more limited from a technical point of view, just because they're instruments of their time and weren't asked to play multiphonics so much or do these kind of strange and wonderful things that saxophones do so easily. But the Renaissance instruments have the most unique voices. I mean, they're voices that we're not accustomed to, and there's a distance there. So that struck me in a way as a musical reflection of the text that, gives us a kind of perspective as modern listeners, kind of looking in on ancient themes that are extremely relevant today, and I would say even more relevant today than when it was written. And already then Katie's text spoke to me as a living person living in society so much. So that was the idea. And that's probably why when I saw that text from Katie, that surprised her that I want a set, I thought this is absolutely perfect for this project.
Yeah, and then embedded in Katie's text, there are also these moments that are really a challenge to a composer, I guess, because they're these redactions, right? Katie, can you just explain to a viewer like what these moments are? They're like these kind of scribbled out spots in the text, right?
Yeah, so I indicate that with brackets and with like an ellipses inside. So in texts that are very, very old or even ancient, we'll find portions of the papyrus that's just been worn away. And so I had remembered that the find of the scriptures in Nag Hammadi in the 1940s, which went back to the early Christian period. When I read the Nag Hammadi text, I would see these brackets and ellipses because the papyrus had been degraded. And that kind of came back to me when I was writing the Anchoress as a kind of strategy for, yes, perhaps her writings just were not legible in certain places, but also, as I was saying before, she perhaps had been redacted herself. I also had in mind, because it was really this time in our country's history when the torture memos were coming out, and the Bybee memos, the redactions would also be indicated in this way, or you would have things completely blacked out. And so that, I read those memos, and it's a real act of power and force and sometimes violence to do that to someone's language. And so in part that is happening to the Anchoress. And I used it at places where she was kind of just about to say something that sounded heretical for her time. So sometimes that would happen, and then you would know that it was an editor or a redactor. Or it could have been just a little bit more random than that, which might have indicated that it was illegible. So I was interested also in the reader or listener having this silence to really squint into and to make something of that silence for themselves. So, you know, poets very often say that it is the reader who finishes the poem, who is also the maker, and that the poem is this living thing that's completed by a reader. And I kind of, it was exploring that even further, I guess, where you really would imagine yourself, what might she say? And then if you look at your own mind, what do I imagine she might put there? Why would I imagine that? I think it could be, you could really reflect on that and have more insight into your own failures, your own desires, your own ability to bear uncertainty, or your inability to be uncertain and not know. So, you know, I really think that the more we admit we don't know, the more faithful we are to, in any tradition, even atheism, the more faithful we are to the mystery that none of us know exactly why, what we're doing here, or how we are to compose ourselves or our days.
Mm-hmm. And so, David, tell us like what you decided to do with these redactions in the text.
Yeah, well, Katie explained the redactions to me so eloquently as she just did. I wanted to reflect rather than to leave a physical silence there, I want to reflect the kind of physical aggression in some of the redactions that Katie was identifying also just now. And write a sound for the saxophones that would be overpowering to the voice. So in some cases, Hyunah, the singer, is still singing a line and the saxophones just play a much louder sound than any human could make. And they play together, and I write for a growl sound, which is something that saxophonists do with their throat, to make something really just a kind of ugly, dirty, loud, abrasive sound. The sound of erasure is what I tried to imagine, in short. So, boy, they did that well. And to me, those redactions add so much, not just to the text, but to the music, because they tell the listener, you should be hearing what she's saying now. She's expressing something, but authority has made this impossible for any of us to hear, has silenced her. So, you know, again, something that really speaks to us in this time as well.
And don't you also have a passage in your score where you write in 12 seconds of chaos? What's up with that?
I do. It literally says 12 seconds of chaos. And it involves percussion instruments and a lot of aleatory. So people are playing patterns and sounds and screaming and shouting the word Anchoress in Greek. I wanted just to present the idea of the chaos of the outside world, to contrast with the order that the Anchoress has created for herself. Mm-hmm. And also she speaks so much of her visions, and the visions are often these kind of glowing, beautiful visions. But at the end of this one, she says your own terror, that she's reflecting the people's personal terror and their own egos and ids in the world. And so I want to reflect terror and chaos for those 12 seconds, which then the singer visually cuts off, that you can see in the video. But we hear it. It's, I think, a striking moment for the ensemble.
Yeah. And then, David, at the same time, the score also has moments of incredible serene beauty and reflective, quiet music. And you quote the 14th century composer Marchot a couple of times, right? So what does he stand for in your music? Why him?
Yeah, thank you. Michaud being one of the first internationally recognized composers, one of the first composers that we would think of as a composer, and who wrote some very popular tunes as well, and music inspired by popular tunes. And so in part, it's me using his clay to make my own sculpture, but also to evoke the time period. Katie has this, Anchoress is living around 1400 in Lower Europe. And, you know, these are some of the sounds that she would have heard, perhaps outside of, you know, I think about what it might, it's hard to even really understand what it would be like to live in an anchor hold, to make that commitment to isolation. But what would it be like to hear the sounds of music kind of wafting outside in the air? So I use a lot of the Michaud and at times pseudo Michaud that I've written to evoke that, the sound of that time, and always through a kind of lens of vision or a lens of isolation. So I want it to sound like it's wafting in the air and being warped by that time and space.
Yeah. So, Katie, I wanted to just raise a question that I think some people might intuitively have when they just hear the sort of the brief outline of what an anchoress is, which can sound, certainly to our modern sensibilities, so unbelievably restrictive and cruel, and it can speak of sort of the desire to sideline women. And yet I think there is this other side, which in the context of of medieval Europe, there were sort of moments of, there are opportunities for agency and freedom and really subversive thinking too, that open up when women choose these extreme spiritual practices. And so I just love to hear from you, like, where you kind of fall on that interpretive scale, or whether you even have to decide whether it just is both of those things.
You mean my anchoress, or do you mean me?
No,
I mean,
anchoress.
I kind of am the anchoress. I mean, I agree with my anchoress. She doesn't say much that I don't also want to stand by, but I mean, I think this, maybe one way to answer that is that you have to really be within something to subvert it. You know, you're not subversive of a tradition that you don't take part in. That's criticism. You know, you might be critical of something, but subversion is really, you know, turning something kind of, if you think of it as like a field, like tilling the field, turning the soil over from the inside of the field and out. And so I've always been interested in seeing tensions in poets and writers and thinkers of what they're pressing against, and how their life has been really defined by the pressure they bring subversively toward their own tradition, because they see in it what is harming people, honestly, and even harm in the mind of making too much of a stricture or a confinement of thought. So, you know, she is deprived, but what she's not deprived of is the making of her own life and the choice to make how she wants to make a life. So I think we would do well, really, if we thought of our lives as creative acts, not just the art that we might pursue, or for me, poetry, but how we make a day, how we make any task we have in the world, how I make my own mothering, how I make my teaching. I mean, I like to think of all those things as creative acts, and press against ideas that are simply there because they're normative, but they don't need to be mine, you know? So I kind of inhabit her, but of course, in an entirely different context.
Yeah. Well, and so that leads me to ask, I guess both of you, when you first picked up the subject of the Anchoress, or David, the poetry that Katie made out of it, I imagine you never would have dreamt that this recording would come out at a time when we've all had this involuntary firsthand experience with pretty extreme isolation and enclosure because of the coronavirus. And I just wonder, Katie, has your own approach to the subject even changed in the last few months? Have you found yourself thinking back to the Anchoress in a new light?
I mean, I think I didn't think of her immediately when I'm in California, when we were suddenly under lockdown. I didn't think of her right away. But I think having written this and studied the tradition of the Anchoress and the anchoretic tradition, maybe I was a little bit prepared to think of this time as kind of another space in which we'd have to make our lives and be creative in certain ways. And I did have thoughts of wondering like what will happen to my mind inside of this confinement or inside of this limit. I mean, positive and negative. I think everyone has thought, okay, when will I kind of lose it? Like, what will be my breaking point? And also, how am I going to shape my days? What will I make of it? So I think it's an extreme condition for all of us in which that question can be asked. David emailed me and brought up the Anchoress early on in the pandemic. And then I kind of thought, oh yeah, because like everyone else, I was also thinking about how to disinfect my groceries and how to teach online and how to have a child at home all the time. So it's not all deep thinking. But then David kind of said something to me about the Anchoress and her coming back to his mind a bit.
David, do you want to jump in? And
Sure. Yeah, I thought about the Anchoress right away, actually. And in a lot of ways, I'm an observer, like anyone who listens to the piece. I'm an audience member now, even though I wrote it, the music. And so, but I'm an observer of Katie's message and her words. And I thought right away about the idea of quarantine and seclusion. And Katie writes quite a bit about this is a time of great mortality. We've been living, obviously, in a period of great division politically. And so the idea that something could cause us to really need to stay home I don't think it has been so impossible or so distant, but you're right, Corinna, this isn't something that we would have thought about or talked about when the piece was written. The Anchoress, a point that I've heard from Katie is that not only is she withdrawn, but in a way she's protected from the horrors of the outside world, from plague, right? Which had a very different impact at that time, and yet we still suffer. So I thought right away about the Anchoress and what her life was, and how even perhaps we could learn from some of what Katie wrote, as she says, about how to build our days and how to think of our days as a creative act. I love that, and I'm going to steal it, but I will give you credit, Katie, I promise. So anyway, yeah, my thoughts were right there. I thought, wow, the piece was already so apropos of our time, and now it's really prescient.
yeah,
I think
Yeah, thank you both so much. I mean, I think it's definitely something that we can all benefit from contemplating a little bit, how to find, vision in dark times, where to develop and nurture an inner freedom when circumstances are out of our control on the outside, and any number of factors that ultimately follow us wherever we are, whatever our circumstances are, and wherever in the timeline of history we live, right? So I think it's a really beautiful project, and it's a great song cycle, great piece of music. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank
This
you.
has been great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.